I never imagined that a single sentence could split my life into a before and an after, but that's exactly what happened on the day of my stepsister's wedding. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old, and until that afternoon I still believed, foolishly, that if I stayed quiet long enough, if I kept proving myself useful, kind, invisible, eventually I would earn my place in my own family. I was wrong. The ballroom was packed with people I barely knew, all dressed in soft pastels and expensive fabrics, crystal glasses clinking under the glow of chandeliers so bright they made everything feel unreal, like a movie set. I sat near the back, smoothing my dress, reminding myself to breathe, telling myself that this day wasn't about me. It was about her. It was always about her. My stepsister, Lauren, had been the center of attention from the moment my dad married her mother when I was 12. She came into our lives loud, confident, already convinced the world owed her something. I came in quiet, already used to shrinking. Growing up, I learned quickly that there were roles in our house. Lauren was the miracle child, the one whose mistakes were funny stories, whose tantrums were blamed on stress, whose dreams were funded without question. I was the extra, the reminder of a life my dad had before, tolerated as long as I didn't demand too much space. Still, I stayed. I helped. I smiled. I thought loyalty might one day be rewarded. At the wedding, I watched Lauren glide across the room in white, laughing too loudly, soaking in every look. People loved her energy. They always had. My dad followed her with his eyes, pride written all over his face. That look used to hurt when I was younger, but by then I'd trained myself not to react. I focused on small details instead, the pattern on the tablecloth, the hum of conversations, the way my hands felt cold no matter how tightly I clasped them together. When it came time for speeches, I felt a familiar tension settle in my chest. Family speeches were always dangerous territory. Lauren took the microphone, her smile wide, confident, practiced. She thanked her friends, her mother, her new husband. The room laughed at the right moments, sighed at the sentimental ones. I started to relax, thinking maybe this time would be different. Maybe I'd imagined the edge in her voice all these years. Then her eyes flicked toward me. She paused just long enough for the silence to feel intentional. "And of course," she said lightly, "there's Rachel, my stepsister." A few people turned to look at me. I forced a polite smile. "She's been around forever," Lauren continued, her tone playful, "but let's be honest, she's kind of unwanted." The word landed heavy, sharp, impossible to misunderstand. Laughter rippled through the room, uncertain at first, then louder as people followed her lead. In that exact moment, I looked at my dad. I don't know why. Some part of me still expected something different, some reflex from childhood that refused to die. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He covered his mouth like he was trying to hide it, but his shoulders shook. He was laughing. "If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people. Because moments like this don't happen in isolation, and silence is how they survive." My ears rang as the laughter continued. I felt heat rush to my face, then drain away, leaving me hollow. Lauren raised her glass, clearly pleased. "No hard feelings," she added, smiling in my direction like she'd done me a favor. The room applauded, grateful to move past the awkwardness. Just another joke, just another moment I was supposed to swallow. But something inside me shifted. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and terrifyingly clear. I realized that what I had spent years trying to earn wasn't being withheld accidentally. It was being denied on purpose. My place as the joke, the afterthought, the expendable one, had been agreed upon long ago, and I'd been the only one still pretending otherwise. As Lauren moved on with her speech, I barely heard her. Memories flooded in instead, moments I'd minimized, explained away. My dad missing my college graduation because Lauren needed him. Family vacations planned around her schedule, never mine. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, then resumed without acknowledging me. Each memory lined up neatly behind that single word: unwanted. I stood up slowly, not because I wanted attention, but because sitting there suddenly felt unbearable. Chairs scraped softly as I moved, but no one stopped me. Why would they? I was doing what I'd always done, removing myself to make things easier for everyone else. As I walked toward the exit, I passed my dad's table. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He didn't call my name. He didn't follow. The hallway outside the ballroom was quiet, carpeted, dim. I leaned against the wall and let myself breathe for the first time in what felt like years. I wasn't crying yet. I was too stunned for that. Instead, I felt something else rising, something unfamiliar and steady. Anger, yes, but also clarity. I finally understood that staying had never protected me. It had only taught them how far they could go. Behind the closed doors, the music swelled again, laughter filling the space I'd left behind. The celebration continued without me, just as it always had. And for the first time, instead of feeling erased by that fact, I felt strangely free. Because if I was truly unwanted in their story, then maybe it was time to stop trying to fit into it. I stayed in that hallway longer than I meant to, listening to the muffled celebration on the other side of the doors, letting the reality of what had happened settle into my bones. Weddings are supposed to be about beginnings, about love and unity, but for me that day marked an ending I'd been avoiding my entire life. As I walked out of the venue and into the cool evening air, I realized no one was going to follow me. No text buzzed in my pocket. No voice called my name. The absence of reaction said more than any apology ever could. I drove home with the radio off, the city lights blurring past my windshield. Every red light gave me another second to replay the scene, to hear the word again, unwanted, and to see my father's laugh like it had been burned into my vision. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, the shock had worn off and left something heavier behind. Grief. Not for the relationship I'd lost that night, but for the one I'd never actually had. Growing up, I used to tell myself stories to make things hurt less. I said my dad was stressed, that he didn't mean to prioritize Lauren, that one day he'd notice how hard I tried. I convinced myself that Lauren's cruelty was just immaturity, that once we were adults she'd grow out of it. I framed every slight as temporary, every exclusion as accidental. That night stripped those stories away. What was left was the truth I'd avoided. They saw me exactly as they treated me. The next morning, my phone finally lit up. Not with concern, not with regret, but with messages layered in defensiveness. Lauren texted first. "Relax, it was a joke, you're so sensitive." My dad followed an hour later. "You shouldn't have left like that. You embarrassed the family." I stared at the screen, reading those words again, and something in me hardened. Even now, the focus wasn't on what had been said, but on how my reaction inconvenienced them. I didn't reply. That silence felt different from the ones before. It wasn't fear or confusion holding me back. It was choice. For once, I was choosing myself. The days that followed were strange. Without the constant background noise of trying to please them, my life felt quieter, almost empty at first. I went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, slept. Friends who'd heard about the wedding checked in, their shock and anger on my behalf both comforting and unsettling. Hearing someone else say, "That was wrong," made me realize how abnormal my family dynamic had been. What I'd normalized, others recognized immediately as cruelty. A week later, my dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. I watched him through the peephole for a long moment before opening the door. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight, hands shoved into his pockets like a teenager waiting to be scolded. He didn't apologize. Instead, he sighed heavily and said, "Lauren S. been really upset. You should talk to her." The words landed with dull familiarity. Even now, I was being asked to manage her feelings. I told him no. It was a simple word, but it felt seismic. His eyebrows shot up, genuine surprise flickering across his face. "She didn't mean it like that," he insisted. "You know how she is." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, "I do, and you know how I am. I'm done pretending it doesn't hurt." For a moment, I thought he might finally hear me. Then his jaw tightened. "You're overreacting," he said, and just like that, the door closed between us in more ways than one. After he left, I sat on my couch and let myself cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears I'd perfected over the years, but deep, shaking sobs that left me exhausted. It was grief, yes, but it was also release. I was mourning the fantasy of a father who would protect me, of a sister who would accept me. Letting go of that fantasy hurt more than the wedding speech ever could, but it was also honest. As the weeks passed, something unexpected happened. Without their constant presence, I started noticing who did show up. A coworker who invited me to dinner without an agenda. A friend who listened without minimizing my feelings. Small moments of kindness that didn't require me to earn them. It dawned on me that love wasn't supposed to feel like a test you were always failing. Comment justice if you believe she deserved justice, because sometimes naming the truth out loud is the first step toward reclaiming it. Lauren tried once more to reach out, this time with a long message about family bonds and forgiveness. She wrote about how weddings are stressful, how humor gets misunderstood, how I should be the bigger person. I read it carefully, noting what was missing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just another attempt to smooth things over without changing anything. I didn't respond. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I blocked her number. Then, after a long pause, I blocked my dad's too. My hand trembled as I pressed the button, the finality of it making my heart race, but beneath the fear was relief. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the next wound. That decision didn't magically fix everything. There were nights I questioned myself, mornings I woke up with a familiar ache of doubt. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But each day I chose distance, the noise grew quieter. The voice in my head that sounded like my family lost its authority. In its place, my own thoughts began to surface, tentative at first, then stronger. I started therapy, something I'd avoided because it felt like admitting weakness. Instead, it became a place where I learned language for experiences I'd never named. Scapegoat, emotional neglect, gaslighting. Hearing those terms applied to my life was jarring, but it was also validating. There was nothing inherently wrong with me. I hadn't failed at belonging. I'd been excluded by design. One evening, months after the wedding, I ran into a distant relative at the grocery store. She hesitated, then said quietly, "I heard what happened. I'm sorry." It wasn't dramatic or public or late-night confessional. It was simple and sincere, and it mattered. Proof that not everyone bought the rewritten version of events. I don't know what Lauren tells people now. I don't know how my dad justifies that laughter to himself. And for the first time, I don't feel compelled to know. Their version of the story no longer defines me. I've stepped out of the role they assigned, and without an audience, their performance has lost its power. The hardest part wasn't the blocking or the silence that followed. It was learning how to sit with myself without the constant need to justify my existence. For so long, my identity had been shaped around being the reasonable one, the forgiving one, the one who didn't rock the boat. When that role disappeared, I felt unmoored, like I was floating without an anchor. But slowly, in that open space, something new began to form. I started paying attention to how my body reacted when I thought about my family. The tightness in my chest when my phone buzzed. The knot in my stomach when I imagined running into them somewhere. Those reactions weren't weakness. They were information. I threw myself into routines that were entirely mine. Morning walks before work, podcasts that made me think instead of shrink, evenings spent reading instead of replaying old conversations in my head. At first, it felt indulgent, almost wrong to center myself that way. I'd been taught that self-focus was selfish, especially for someone like me, someone who was supposed to be grateful just to be included. But the more I practiced, the more I realized how distorted that belief had been. Taking care of myself wasn't a betrayal of anyone. It was a correction. About 3 months after the wedding, I ran into Lauren's mother at a mutual friend's gathering. I hadn't known she'd be there, and for a moment my pulse spiked, instinct telling me to prepare for impact. She approached me cautiously, eyes flicking around as if making sure no one was listening. "I heard you've been keeping your distance," she said, not unkindly. I nodded. "It's what I need right now," she sighed. "Lauren was just joking, she didn't expect you to take it so hard." The words were familiar, almost comforting in their predictability. Something surprised me then. I didn't feel the urge to argue. I didn't feel the need to defend myself or convince her of anything. I simply said, "Intent doesn't erase impact," and let the silence do the rest. She looked startled, like she hadn't expected that response. Maybe no one had ever said it to her before. Maybe it didn't matter. I excused myself and walked away, heart pounding, but proud. That single sentence felt like reclaiming years of swallowed protests. As time went on, bits of the truth began to surface in places I hadn't anticipated. A cousin messaged me late one night, admitting she'd always felt uncomfortable with how Lauren treated me but never spoke up. A former neighbor of my dad's told me she'd noticed how often I was left out of family events. Each revelation was bittersweet. It hurt to know others had seen it too, but it also confirmed that I hadn't imagined any of it. I wasn't too sensitive. I wasn't misreading the room. The room had simply been hostile. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once, because recognition is the first domino, and once it falls, the rest tend to follow. My dad tried one last time to reach me, this time through an email that was carefully worded and emotionally vague. He wrote about family loyalty, about how life is short, about how holding grudges only hurts yourself. There was no mention of the wedding speech, no acknowledgement of his laughter. It read like a lecture copied from a self-help article. I stared at it for a long time before closing my laptop. I realized then that he wasn't reaching out to understand me. He was reaching out to restore the old order, where I absorbed the damage quietly, and he never had to feel uncomfortable. I didn't reply. Instead, I wrote my own letter, not to send, but to clarify my thoughts. I wrote about what it felt like to be 12 years old and suddenly feel like a guest in my own home, about the years of comparison and dismissal, about the wedding, the word unwanted echoing louder than the music ever had. Writing it all down was exhausting, but it was also grounding. It turned chaos into a narrative I controlled. There were moments of doubt, of course. Holidays were the hardest. Walking past families laughing together stirred old aches. I'd wonder if I'd overreacted, if I should have just let it go like I always had. But then I'd remember my dad's laugh, the ease with which he joined in, and the doubt would fade. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. The real shift came when I stopped defining justice as an apology I might never receive. Justice didn't arrive with fireworks or public confessions. It came quietly, in the form of peace, in the absence of constant tension, in the ability to make plans without considering who might be offended, in the relief of knowing that no one could humiliate me for entertainment anymore because they no longer had access. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in a store window and barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I stood differently. Shoulders back, gaze steady. The woman staring back at me wasn't trying to disappear. She was fully present, taking up space without apology. That realization made me smile right there on the sidewalk. I still don't know what my future relationship with my family will look like, if there will ever be one at all. What I do know is that I'm no longer willing to trade my dignity for belonging. The cost is too high, and the return was always too small. Walking away wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of self-respect. By the time 6 months had passed, the sharpness of the wedding memory had dulled, but it never disappeared completely. Instead, it settled into me like a scar, something I could trace with my mind whenever I needed to remind myself why I'd made the choices I had. Life without my family's constant presence wasn't magically perfect, but it was honest. I no longer woke up bracing for disappointment. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, trying to predict how to avoid conflict. That mental space, once freed, filled itself with possibilities I hadn't known how to imagine before. I started saying yes to things that scared me. I took a short solo trip to a nearby coastal town, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt entitled to. Walking along the shoreline at dawn, listening to waves crash against the rocks, I felt grounded in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. For the first time, I wasn't measuring my worth by how useful or agreeable I was. I was simply present. Occasionally, news about Lauren drifted my way through distant channels. I heard her marriage was under strain, that the picture-perfect beginning hadn't translated into a stable reality. Part of me felt a flicker of vindication, quickly followed by something softer. Pity, maybe, or understanding. Lauren had learned to secure attention through dominance and cruelty because it had always worked for her. Without an audience willing to laugh along, that strategy was bound to collapse eventually. But her consequences weren't my responsibility to manage, and recognizing that felt like another small victory. My dad remained mostly silent, save for the occasional indirect attempt to reassert contact. A birthday card slipped under my door by a relative, an email forwarded by someone who meant well. Each time I paused, checked in with myself, and chose what felt right instead of what felt expected. More often than not, that meant no response. Silence, I'd learned, could be a boundary rather than a punishment. What surprised me most was how my perspective on community shifted. Growing up, I'd been taught that family was the foundation of everything, that without it you were unmoored, incomplete. But as months passed, I realized how many forms community could take. Coworkers who covered shifts without complaint. Friends who remembered details about my life and asked follow-up questions. Even strangers, brief encounters that carried unexpected kindness. These connections weren't bound by obligation. They were chosen, mutual, and that made them powerful. There were moments, though, when anger resurfaced. Random triggers, a joke taken too far in a group setting, a dismissive comment that echoed old patterns. When that happened, I let myself feel it instead of pushing it down. Anger, I learned, wasn't the enemy. It was a signal that something mattered, that a boundary was being tested. The difference now was that I trusted myself to respond. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled across a post Lauren had shared months earlier. It was a photo from the wedding, cropped carefully to exclude me, captioned with something about family and unconditional love. The irony was almost laughable. In the past, that would have sent me spiraling, questioning my reality. This time, I simply closed the app. I didn't need to correct the narrative. Anyone who mattered already knew the truth, and anyone who didn't was not someone I needed to convince. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding, because stories like this thrive in silence, and visibility is how patterns like these lose their power. As I continued building my life, I noticed a subtle but profound shift in how I related to others. I no longer over-explained myself. I no longer apologized for having needs. When conflicts arose, I addressed them directly instead of internalizing them as personal failures. This wasn't because I'd become hardened or cold. It was because I'd learned that respect starts with how you treat yourself. A year after the wedding, I attended another family event, this time for someone on my mother's side. I hesitated before going, worried old dynamics might resurface, but the experience surprised me. People greeted me warmly. Conversations flowed without tension. No one made me the punchline. It struck me then that dysfunction had been localized, not universal. I hadn't been defective. I'd been placed in an environment that required someone to absorb the negativity, so others could feel superior. Driving home that night, I reflected on how far I'd come. The memory of my dad laughing still hurt, but it no longer defined me. His reaction was a reflection of his limitations, not my worth. Understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it reframed it in a way that gave me back control. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what I'd say if I ever confronted them again. I imagined speeches filled with eloquent truths and sharp clarity. But as time passed, those imagined conversations grew quieter, less urgent. Closure, I realized, doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from no longer needing an answer. I began to see my story not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. A moment that forced me to choose between staying small and stepping into myself. The humiliation at the wedding had been real, public, and deeply painful, but it had also been undeniable. It stripped away excuses, illusions, and hope built on denial. In doing so, it gave me something I'd never had before: freedom. That freedom came with responsibility. I had to decide who I wanted to be without the old roles. I chose to be someone who listens to her instincts, who values peace over approval, who understands that being unwanted by those who benefit from your silence is not a failure. It's a sign you're no longer playing along. The longer I lived in that freedom, the more I understood how deeply silence had shaped me. I had been trained over decades to believe that endurance was the same thing as strength. That if I could just take a little more, bend a little further, stay agreeable no matter what, I would eventually be rewarded with acceptance. Walking away shattered that belief. What replaced it was quieter, steadier, and far more durable: self-trust. The knowledge that I could recognize mistreatment and choose not to participate in it anymore. People sometimes ask me if I regret not standing up for myself in that ballroom. If I wish I de-grabbed the microphone, confronted Lauren, exposed my father's laughter for what it was. The truth is, for a while I did. I replayed alternate versions of the night in my head, each one ending with applause and vindication. But with time, I realized something important. I didn't need to perform my pain to make it real. Leaving was my statement. Choosing myself was my response. And it spoke louder than any speech ever could. There were still consequences, of course. Mutual acquaintances grew awkward around me, unsure which version of the story to believe. Some drifted away entirely, choosing the comfort of familiarity over the discomfort of truth. That used to hurt. Now I see it as information. Anyone who required me to minimize my own experience to stay connected was never a safe place to land. Letting those relationships fade made room for ones that didn't require me to disappear. One afternoon, I found an old photo while cleaning out a drawer. It was from years earlier, a family gathering where everyone was smiling. At first glance, it looked happy. But when I studied it more closely, I noticed something I'd missed before. I was on the edge of the frame, half cut off, smiling too hard. Even then, my body had known. It had leaned away, bracing. I slipped the photo back into the drawer, not out of anger, but acceptance. That image no longer had power over me. It was just evidence of how long I'd survived something I didn't deserve. As I grew more comfortable with my boundaries, I noticed how often people confuse them with punishment. When I didn't respond to messages, some accused me of being cold. When I declined invitations that involved my family, I was told I was holding a grudge. What they didn't see was the work happening beneath the surface. The daily practice of choosing peace. The effort it took to unlearn reflexes that had once kept me safe, but now kept me stuck. Boundaries weren't about teaching anyone a lesson. They were about protecting what I was building. The irony is that once I stopped chasing approval, it started showing up in unexpected ways. At work, my confidence translated into leadership. I spoke up more, trusted my ideas, stopped apologizing before offering input. Friends commented on the change, telling me I seemed lighter, more grounded. I wasn't louder or more aggressive. I was simply present, and that presence carried weight. I thought often about the word unwanted and how casually it had been used, like a joke, like a truth everyone was in on. For so long, I'd internalized it without realizing it. I'd accepted scraps of affection because I believed full belonging wasn't meant for me. Letting go of my family forced me to confront that belief head-on. And once I did, it crumbled. Being unwanted by people who thrive on hierarchy and cruelty doesn't mean you're unworthy. It means you no longer fit their narrative. And that's not a flaw, it's growth. If this shocked you, comment strong below, because recognizing yourself in a story like this can be unsettling, and naming that reaction matters. There are still days when grief sneaks up on me. A song, a memory, a random comment about family can open a door I thought I'd closed. But grief now feels different. It's not a sign that I made the wrong choice. It's a reminder of what I lost and what I saved. I lost the illusion of unconditional family support. I saved my sense of self. I don't know if my dad ever thinks about that moment, about the sound of his own laughter echoing through that ballroom. I don't know if Lauren ever understands the weight of the words she used so lightly. What I do know is that their understanding is no longer required for my healing. I don't need them to validate my experience for it to be real. I lived it. I felt it. And I chose differently because of it. What happened at that wedding didn't break me. It clarified me. It showed me exactly where I stood and gave me the chance to step somewhere new. I took it. And every day since, I've been building a life that doesn't require me to be smaller, quieter, or endlessly forgiving to be allowed in the room. I used to think walking away meant failure, that it would confirm everything they implied about me. Now I understand it was the bravest decision I've ever made. I didn't lose a family that day. I lost the need to beg for a place where respect never existed. What I gained was quieter but stronger. I gained mornings without dread, conversations without armor, and a sense of worth that doesn't depend on anyone else's mood. If you're listening to this and wondering whether you're allowed to choose yourself, let me be clear. You are. You don't need permission. You don't need a final blow-up or a perfect explanation. You're allowed to leave rooms where your pain is entertainment and your silence is expected. I don't tell this story to be seen as strong. I tell it so you know strength can look like walking out without shouting, blocking numbers without announcing it, and building a life that doesn't revolve around proving anything. Healing isn't loud. It's consistent. Before you go, take a second to like this video if it helped you feel less alone. In the comments, tell me this. What boundary are you afraid to set, and what's stopping you? And subscribe, not just for more stories, but because these conversations matter, and staying connected reminds us we're not imagining what we feel. Your story matters here, and your voice belongs, even when others tried to erase it from your life.